To revise something is to change the way in which something has been perceived that otherwise was uncritically received. There are many examples. One key one in recent Anglo-Irish historiography is Cromwell and the massacres in Wexford and Drogheda. He was believed to have massacred 2 whole Irish towns, and Irish people have been taught this for centuries. Indeed, in popular Irish culture, the word Cromwell is worse than the C word, because he killed everybody in those towns, and all the women, and all the children, and all the animals. It now appears that in Wexford and Drogheda, the Catholic parishioner and Darcian records state that nearly everybody in that area who lived before his army passed through lived after his army passed through. But the number of people killed may have been 1,000 combatants who were slaughtered at the high point of a battle when they themselves had surrendered and probably put up the white flag to draw people in before they used arms, which in most forms of war does result in such an event. That event occurred in the context of Protestants being massacred in 1641. So Cromwell has been revisited and has been revised, and there's a degree to which it's taken 4 centuries, and this is just historical events between different peoples in these islands, for a slightly more judicious, a slightly more rounded, a less emotive, a more temperate view of massacres and events which are believed to have occurred to be rewritten and enter into mainstream historical record. Even the Boer War and its origins in 1899 through 1902 between ourselves and the Afrikaners has been revised and looked at again. But that is a war about which the controversial heat and the gas flare of intensity is much lower down. Now, when you're dealing with events like the First World War, men who went through that experience saw a sort of factory-type killing. Millions of men slaughtered each other in mud and filth and barbed wire. These were extraordinarily savage events, almost sort of revolutions in consciousness for the generation that went through them. Therefore, even to have revised views about the circumstances that led to that war has been very controversial. In the First World War, Lloyd George and others invented a large strand of German atrocity story, which was revealed in 1928 in the House of Lords. This is the idea that the Germans committed bestial atrocities in Belgium, the Germans ran around with babies on spikes, that they committed atrocities against prisoners that were outside of the European consciousness and form of civility. It was later realised that it was complete propaganda. Now, media understanding was much less cynical in 1914, 1918. There's a degree to which a large number of white people were stimulated by propagandistic elites to loathe and detest each other and to kill not just hundreds of thousands but millions of each other right across Europe. Now, the First World War's dipped down. There's hardly anyone left. But the Second World War is still alive in human consciousness today. Mussolini and Franco have largely been historicised. Their dictatorial regimes are seen as regrettable but normal. The National Socialist one is not, and remains in a sort of shadow. And while we have the present dispensation that we have in Europe, that will have to be so. We in 2007 are living in the after effects of the Second European Civil War, which is really what the Second World War in Europe amounted to. And the First World War was the first European Civil War. These things are much nearer the edge. You'll lose your career, you'll lose your reputation, you'll lose your respect, you'll be put in prison for having certain counter-propositional views about historical events. In several major European societies, at least 10,000 people have been arraigned for these crimes of thought, including many major historians. Many historians, if you read them today, know that this is a minefield they will not go near. The Chancellor of contemporary federal Germany would like to extend, as a particular remit of the Constitution/treaty, the idea that revisionist laws, or more accurately anti-revisionist laws, that exist in certain continental societies which have allegedly quote-unquote known fascism at a particular period be extended to this society and to all other EU access states, including a great wave of Eastern European countries who of course have acceded to the Union in recent years. My father's generation was told they fought in the Second World War for freedom of speech, and now we have to attenuate what we say before we even get down to saying it, so that we will not fall liable to particular laws that haven't even been introduced yet. In the town that I live in, a selection of sixth formers from all schools were recently taken on an Auschwitz tour, paid for by the local authority and its taxpayers, to prove the evil of racism to prove that voting for certain tendencies is regarded as a priori illegitimate and immoral, and also to look at a crime against humanity, leading to the need for universal constructions of law and of morality, and leading to trials whereby political leaders, in conflicts that have little to do with what happened in Europe, can themselves be arraigned. The trial and death of Saddam Hussein, involving procedures very close to the Nuremberg ones, very close to a similar ideology that was applied to post-war Yugoslavia, very close to an ideology that was applied to some of the fallen militarist leaders from Imperial Japan. And the reason for this is the belief that certain tendencies are evil and that other tendencies make mistakes and have excesses and commit blunders or are inopportune. Even in relation to the Iraq War, there is a mass debate within our contemporary establishment. The Lancet, which is the journal of our doctors, has said methodologically that 670,000 Iraqis have perished since the invasion. And Blair and Bush say it's a lie. We refute their figures. We refute the methodology upon which those figures are based. The actual figure is 170,000. Why do they bother about that? They bother about it because in the war of position and the crucible of political struggle, the numbers matter and are of crucial importance. Because they enable you to demonize one side and extol another. They enable you to excuse one thing as deviation or error, subject to revisionism of one sort or another, or you actually say that one tendency, by virtue of these actions, is beyond even what it is to be political, is a species of Satanism, is that which you have nothing to do with. One of the reasons we have a left-wing society is partly because conservatism is brain dead in the West and is terrified and is afraid. But one of the reasons it's afraid is because of this area of secular demonology. Because when you have to think in an illiberal way, you will go over there. You will have to touch certain thinkers who actually are in that proximity. And that is demonic, and you have to remain in the centre. And if you remain in the centre, you can't oppose the liberal left. You can't oppose the world as it now is inside Western societies. We are now in the position that we're invading other societies to impose what exists here on them. And of course there's a lot of people inside the West who do not agree with the dispensation that exists here. Now, Germany was divided at the end of the Second World War into two occupation regimes. In contemporary history and journalistic writing, the Eastern regime of Albrecht and Honecker was in some ways described as it was, a country that built a wall to keep its citizenry in and shot them if they got over the barbed wire in an attempt to get over that wall. The Western zone, though, was never said to be occupied. It had been liberated by Western power. We had set up a zone there that later became the Federal Republic of Western Germany. Since then, the German political elite and beyond it, Central European political elite, have been terrified of any reversal in the demonic fortunes of the parties that fought the war that brought them to power. Any change, any shift, any relativism even, any minor factual amendment, which always will happen in history, becomes decisive. What happened in the middle of Europe in the 20th century is cardinal to certainly a definition of white or Caucasian identity today. One of the many reasons why our people find it so difficult to assert themselves is because of these events and how they've been interpreted. Because as soon as they say, this is the English flag behind it, this is the British flag, the Swedish flag, this is the German flag, you are entering into proximity to moral danger. You're actually tiptoeing towards the first thing a liberal journalist will ask you. I was once representative of an organisation called Western Goals, the Cold War organisation. The second question the journalist asked me on mainstream media was, what's your view of the Holocaust? And he had it on his paper there. They had two lines. One is, treat them like a negative barrister. They're hostile to your case, and you rag them, and you try and take them down. That's the first mental proposition for the interviewer. The second is National Socialism shower. Get them squirming on that and what they've got to say about what Enoch Powell said, or what they've got to say about the European Union, or what they've got to say about contemporary crime is of no significance at all, because you have them there in the pit, squirming. It's pre-programmed, and quite deliberately so. There's irony piled upon irony, because of course many of the people who use these weapons partly don't care about the truth themselves. Now, a series of historians, often privately funded, often researching themselves, have published a series of books questioning the veracity of some of these events, including people who've used other names which are not their own. Because you have to understand that this was extreme and deep thought criminality. a range of writers, none of them in the United States. Why? Because they at least have, strangely, the covering of First Amendment rights and can publish freely. Which is why an enormous amount of this material, of course, has come back into Europe. It's come back even beyond Europe into the Arab and Muslim world. Tony Hancock said to me years ago, what should happen to this material? And I said, the internet will solve all that for you. But one way to do it, just one of many, is to give it to the Muslim world. Because it will then come back into the West in a way which is not seen congruent with the radical right within the West. Now, many of these revision historians, of course, are historians. They do not agree with each other. Others may well be dissentient Jews. Others are radical neo-fascists and ultra-conservatives. Others are Germans who believe the use of the Shoah is a form of racism against them, that it is used to demonise people of German ancestry all over the world. The interesting thing about these crimes and the historical narrative through which they are institutionalised is that they began affecting a particular nation state and its warrior elite at a particular time. Then it extended to some of the allied nationalities. Then it extended out to, reflexively, the nationalities of people who destroyed that country. Now if somebody who's English asserts themselves in an ethnic manner with a little bit too much militancy, they will be accused of spiritually being aligned to those forces when they are descended from men who flew planes that obliterated the cities of that government. What has happened is it's become a generic form of thought criminality which extends out to almost all Caucasians and then beyond, including in the victor and successor states. So it's become a generalised negative propaganda against all of us, stretching from Iceland to Australia. No one is immune from the taint of this retrospective quote-unquote criminality. So it's being used as an extraordinarily effective thought weapon. The Daily Telegraph had a poll about 4 years ago in which they said to the average Brit, do you believe the Shoah occurred? Yes. Do you believe the numbers that are used in contemporary historical record are right? No. That is interesting. That is, Joe Public, who've had nothing but one view, are prepared to accept that the figures are exaggerated, which of course, if you put it in a certain way, will get you imprisoned in certain contemporary Western societies. The irony is that because we have a conflict between state law and power and a desire to crush dissent and historical research, all sorts of little people, nerdy academics, people who don't look both ways before they cross, they get it smashed down in the middle because it's a doctrine and an ideology of power against power in terms of memory. If you're a German citizen and you say what the Israeli state says occurred, you can be imprisoned. Because Yad Vashem says that the number of victims for the Shoah is a half of the number that you're supposed to use. Therefore, we have a situation that European countries will imprison their nationals for saying what the Israeli president can say. But that's because it's about power. It's not about truth. The view is that the significant proportion of the European population believe that the post-war settlement was unjust, that it was victors' justice, that the government in 1948 was a partly illegitimate one, that there is unfinished business there, that America's domination of half of the continent was a different version of Soviet domination of the other half of the continent, that the endless laws of memory and trace of memory are an endless vilification of people of Germanic ancestry. During the 1970s and 80s, there was an enormous split in Germany between the generations, and there was an enormous amount of intergenerational hatred, and far-left terrorism grew out of that. A rebellion against everything German, a rebellion against everything that had gone before, a destruction and a hostility towards everything that was prior. The extraordinary damage psychologically that was done to modern Germany by the self-hatred and loathing that has been institutionalised there as a result of the discourse of the Shoah is incalculable. People have been partly spiritually destroyed, morally destroyed. Because before you take a structure down, you take it down spiritually and morally and in terms of its ethical sense of itself. You take down that which is above the top consciousness of the rational mind. You take down that which leads to a morally efficacious sense of self. If you grow up believe you're descending from murderers and your nationality is worthless, and the most extreme form that your nationality took has no value, you will end up with a low self-loathing population, as the Benoit has described it, which characterise a large number of Western individuals at the present time. It's a sort of moral and psychological form of cancer. And almost everybody who doesn't like the changes in Western societies has had this moment. Almost everybody who's thought, I might in the 1970s like National Front. No, you don't. What do you mean? No, you don't. Because you're going to be linked to a trajectory that links you to this. Your average Western person says, no, I'm not going there. A bit of conservatism is all right, but I'm not going there. And this means that we are partly mentally defenceless in relation to many of the changes which have occurred. And there is, within contemporary liberalism, an extraordinary parallelism in the use of this idea. People who hold these sorts of ideas, that everybody who's gone into this area faces demonisation, not just white people either. Anyone who touches this area faces it. And it's created a sort of paralysis and a double reflex in our entire population. It means that the most right-wing view that's allowed in our society is virtually President Bush and those around him. That's where you can go and remain within the spectrum of the non-demonic within secular modernity. You go outside that, you are morally other. And it is not nonsense that I'm speaking. Almost every self-conscious generation that's come up since the war has this moment. Irrespective of education, of class, and of everything else, there's this moment when people will say, you're one of them, and it leads to that, and I don't want to know. And the problem is that we, as a European civility, will gradually disappear because the generation that fought in that particular war and came after, well, they will disappear. But the memory and the ideological reinterpretation of these events will not. Blair was asked in 1999 why the Second World War was fought, and he said it was to protect the Jewish race from extermination. Which is an extraordinary remark. And an extraordinarily illiterate remark. But this is what you get because, one, an enormous number of people are totally miseducated now about normative historical truths. The fact that the Second World War resulted from a confluence of parallel institutions of power all out of the window with Blair. Blair views the whole of that war and the present intellectual clerisy in academic and intellectual life, and they all agree with this view. This war was fought from the retrospective outcome of ovens at its end. It had nothing to do with rivalry between states, nothing to do with ideological conflict. It had to do with some of the victims of that particular conflict. So why has this event become so crucial? It's become so crucial because it justifies the post-war aid. It justifies Western multiculturalism. It justifies mass immigration. It justifies forms of liberal and attenuated European integration, because separate nationalism is a bad thing. Therefore, you integrate to overcome the memory and legacy of events which have occurred. No one's interested in the European Union, let alone most Europeans. But there is a degree to which, whenever they get a chance to vote on these things, a certain mania of consciousness intrudes. We had a referendum recently in 2 continental countries that were before then thought to be very pro-EU. One politician from one of those countries went to stand in the demarcated fields of Auschwitz and said on mass European and world television, if people vote no in this very minor methodological referendum stroke poll, they are voting for the Shoah. They are voting for this. Jack Straw said that the rejection of those treaties would be a moral disaster for Europe. So there's a degree to which the post-war world is based upon this. And one of the most crucial reasons for this is the domination of the whole of the Western conception by the United States. And the domination of Mideast politics by Israel and Israel's conception of itself in relation to the United States and America's conception of its own self-interest as almost being allied with Israel. And you have radical Protestantism as the cultural discourse in the background that forces a virtual merger between the two. And this means that European countries, whether they like it or not, in the First and in the Second Gulf War were dragged along to fight essentially an Israeli war pursued by American power, whether they wanted to or not. We've spent $6.5 billion of our cash in Iraq. We've lost 200 men. We've achieved absolutely nothing. And we have done so because in 1956 we attempted a very minor independent move with the Israelis and with the French and earned American disapproval. And that was a very cold burst. And American power faced from internally within the West is awesome, even though they have very little idea what to do with it. And yet in a strange way they do know exactly what they're doing. And what they're doing is imposing the logic of an attenuated French Revolution, of the American Revolution, on the whole planet. Equality, indeterminacy, aspiritualism, materialism, the right to shop, the right to vote, parties that are the same, human rights, civil rights, Israel always safe. This is the agenda that's being pushed all over the world. This means that when you attack against certain historical verities, even in relation to numbers, you are pushing against the nature of the modern world as it's been constructed. An element of the emotion around these issues is semi-religious. There are many people who regard blasphemy in relation to this orthodoxy in the way that atheism would have been treated in this country before 1800. It is you are outside if you posit this. To just say time will pass, people will forget. No, because these things will be put before them always and forever and a day. And if you are perceived as a country that links at all with the ideas of the regimes that fell in flames and have been demonised by trial, even if you fought against them in the past, you are part of that trajectory of guilt. Now, the figures that were adumbrated immediately after the war of 7.5 million have come down to 6, have come down to 4.5. So we have a sort of collapse in some of the paraphernalia of this particular historical narrative. But what's really happened is that the political use of this has partly separated off from revisionism because it's become an ideological weapon, independent of the facts. So there is a degree to which, even if there is a sort of conceptual shift, and Western ideology in the next 50 years recomposes itself to say, well, there was an error about these figures, and there was communist post-war exaggeration, and we're now revising it all for you, maybe for a lesser figure. But the impact of the moral statement will in a sense be the same or different. Indeed, to say that because the figure may well be less, that less of a moral crime is imputed will be made to be worse than the prior discourse, because it's not really about those who suffered and those who died and those who didn't. It's about who rules the West and who rules Britain and who rules the United States and what the future of the world will be. And much of the Western world is now convulsed by the idea that we are pitched headlong into an antithetical struggle with this dominant world. But in actual fact, of course, although cultures and civilizations will clash and will often clash violently with each other, the reason for these wars and the reason for this contestation began in 1945, began in 1939, began in 1914, and is a continuation of these processes. We are always in a situation whereby if we were to chart an independent course, we would have to overthrow American foreign policy in the last 50 years. I was once asked on a platform for a party that I used to be a member of what my view of Israel was, and I said, Israel's a terrorist state. And it's not a morally legitimate one. When America bombed Serbian positions in the 1990s, they said they were doing it to stop ethnic cleansing. But Israel is based on ethnic cleansing. So one standard for one and one standard for another. But that's life and that's power. There's a degree to which we will be dragged into war after war in relation to the Third World, in relation to American power politics over the Gulf and their need for oil, but also we will be dragged into the radical and increasingly radical consequences of the post-war dispensation. The fact that in a way the governments of white people in Europe were occupied twice over after 1945 by communism and by American capitalism and by a particular worldview which is not a European one, and that the occupation of the West was subtler and deeper and more invasive and more destructive than the occupation of the East. It's broken down people in the West far more than people were broken in the East, because it's destroyed elements of their self-respect. Peter Hain was asked recently, what has Western civilization achieved? He said, nothing. These are the people, he said, with his finger in the air. He said, these are the people who gave us Stalin and Hitler. These are the people who gave us that. It's interesting, isn't it? This is his own civilization. And all we've done is that. We've created no millennia of civilization. There's been no libraries. There's been no classical or neoclassical sculpture. There's been no Beethoven. There's just death and pillage and authoritarianism. This is allegedly what we are responsible for. And this is a man in our government. As though we're beasts without mind and without wit and without intelligence. Civilization and barbarism, often in a Western, Faustian context, are interwoven with each other. We believe in the ferocious remaking of reality, moment by moment and layer by layer. When you ask a contemporary liberal what do they believe, they don't really know, and they fear that if they authenticate themselves, they'll be revisiting the after effects of the Shoah. That's the truth. That is the mental construction that people face. Any white self-assertion is regarded as an act of semi-criminality now. And it is because we cannot face certain facts, certain misreading of facts. Let's have a few facts. Hundreds of thousands of Germans who were pushed out of Slavic countries they've been in for centuries decimation of German cities by British terror bombing. Let's have a few other facts. Massacres of large numbers of white Russian prisoners. When we decamped them back to Yugoslavia and they went before people's courts to receive the summary justice of the masses, the large number of death squads who roamed French towns and villages after the liberation, and they said, we're with the free forces of the French interior, and you had a book by Charles Maurras on your shelf, and they drag out and shoot you in the back of the head and put your body in a ditch, and so on and so on. You see, there are facts and facts, and there are those that are used one way and those that are used another. There's a minor political historian who's at the University of Bath, and he wrote a book about fascism in the last 10 years. And he was asked about revisionism, and he was asked particularly about Holocaust Day and the Shoah and its use in schools as a means of moral instruction. And he said, I'm worried about it. And the researcher said, you worried? Why are you worried? And he said, there's two problems with it. One is there are too many Muslims in British schools, and some of them will stand up and say, I don't believe in it. And the second thing he said is there's too many lies have been told about it after the war. Too many lies, and it's becoming dangerous propagandistically. And the chap said, well, if that's the case, what do we do? He said, I've got an answer. What we do is we conflate that in with all other crimes. So we have a genocide day, because identity, if it leads to the consequence through a history of massacre, will affect all groups. So all groups partially de-escalate all of their rival and competing identities, so we have one world for us all. That is in some ways what is proposed. That is why, although radical right people are thought by others to be full of hate against other groups and so on, it is actually a philosophical position about structures from the past and how they relate to where we are now, and also how we can live on this planet together without losing identity, which gives life meaning, because without it there is no context for art or beauty or philosophy or science or knowledge or progress of any sort. Because if somebody says to you, who are you, and you have no answer, all civilization will have come to an end. Right-wing views are about difference, they're about inequality, they're about distinction, and they're about meaning. What we have to do is to understand that things have been used against us for ideological reasons, irrespective of the facts. And only when we have the courage to do that will we revive. So it's really only when a leader of revivalist opinion says, well, what's your view of the Shoah then? And they say, we've stepped over that. What do you mean you stepped over that? Are you minimising its importance for humanity? You say, we are minimising its importance for our form of humanity.